I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 116 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel, and please address all comments through the chair. Of course, today we're studying derelict and abandoned vessels pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on February 27, 2024. The committee is commencing its study of derelict and abandoned vessels. I want to welcome our witnesses here today from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have Mr. Brooks, Director, Marine Environmental and Hazards Response. We have Ms. Nim, Director General Response. We have Ms. Viril, Compliance and Enforcement, and on Zoom we have Stephanie Hopper, Director General Small Craft Harbours Programme. From Department of Transportation we have Mr. Heaney, Director Marine Protection Environmental Policy, Sean Rogers, Executive Director Legislative, Regulatory and International Affairs, and we have Joanne Weiss-Reed, Director Operations and Regulatory Development. Thank you for taking time to appear today. I believe, Ms. Nim, you are the official for delivering remarks. You have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. You have the floor.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Catherine Name, and I am the Director General of Response for the Canadian Coast Guard. My colleagues and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee.
The Wrecked, Abandoned, or Hazardous Vessels Act are shared between the Minister of Transport Canada and the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard. The Canadian Coast Guard addresses cases that involve hazardous vessels, while Transport Canada is responsible for impacts to navigation, irresponsible vessel ownership, and abandoned vessels. We also work closely with other levels of government and Indigenous and coastal communities, as some areas where problem vessels are found implicate other jurisdictions. The Canadian Coast Guard acts as a single window for notifications to the Government of Canada and receives all reports of vessels of concern. Each vessel is assessed for the risk it represents to the marine environment, the public, and public infrastructure. The vessel is also added to the Government of Canada's National Inventory, a regularly updated public repository that is available on our website. Si le navire ne représente
If the vessel does not represent a hazard, the case is transferred to our colleagues at Transport Canada. Since the launching of our National Inventory of Problem Vessels, more than 2,100 vessels have been listed. Together with our partners, we are working hard to address these problem vessels. The number has now dropped to 1,358.
The Government of Canada has invested nearly $300 million in implementing a national strategy through the Oceans Protection Plan to address these problem vessels. WAVA became law in 2019 and is helping to protect the marine environment while reducing the burden on taxpayers. The Canadian Coast Guard has established a risk assessment methodology to prioritize vessels that pose the highest risk. Risks can include posing a hazard to the marine environment, the public, the economy, infrastructure, and more. Since 2016, the Government of Canada has removed 791 wrecked, abandoned, or hazardous vessels across Canada. WAVA makes it very clear that vessel owners have a key role to play in preventing their vessels from becoming hazardous. They must maintain their vessel, keep it in good working order, and dispose of it responsibly at the end of its life cycle. Owners are responsible for the costs of addressing their problem vessel. This includes cleanup or repairs and any necessary remediation action taken by the Canadian Coast Guard. La Garde Côtière Canadienne travaille.
The Canadian Coast Guard works with owners to mitigate any risk caused by problem vessels using a gradual approach to implement the law. If the owner doesn't take reasonable measures to deal with the dangers created by their vessels, the Canadian Coast Guard will take immediate measures to prevent, mitigate, or eliminate the risks.
The Canadian Coast Guard launched its compliance and enforcement program to ensure that owners of hazardous vessels are held accountable. Under law, the Canadian Coast Guard can now issue an administrative monetary penalty to an owner who fails to comply with the direction to take actions to address hazards created by their vessels. Il convient de noter que la plupart des...
It is worth noting that most Canadians are responsible vessel owners who take the necessary steps to address any issues with their vessels. Our priority will always be to work collaboratively with the vessel owner.
Strikes a balance between the polluter pay principle, meaning those who create hazards to the marine environment will bear the costs of their actions. In those instances, the law enables the Canadian Coast Guard to cost recover its expenses from the owner or their insurer. The Canadian Coast Guard is making tangible progress on addressing problem vessels that pose the highest risk to the marine environment or to public safety across Canada. This includes the use of innovative technologies for remote vessel monitoring and expanding our partnerships with Indigenous and coastal communities. We work closely with our colleagues at Transport Canada to implement a regime that works with vessel owners to protect Canada's marine environment from the risks and hazards posed by wrecked, abandoned, and hazardous vessels. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You had 7 seconds to spare, which is abnormal for anyone to give an opening statement in less than 5 minutes. I want to thank you for that. Before I go to our first round of questioning, I want to welcome Mr. Godin, who's subbing in for somebody, I don't know who, and good to have Blaine Calkins back again as sitting in for somebody, but he's quite familiar with the Fisheries and Oceans Committee as he served on it for a number of years. And of course, Dr. Hanley, who's subbing in for Patrick Weiler. I believe Mr. Hanley is a regular member, but he's been moved to another committee, and Mr. Weiler will be the new member, and he gets to fill in for him now the first day. So we'll now go to our round of questioning. Mr. Small, you're...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our guests and visitors and our audience today. Mr. Chair, I'd like to extend deepest condolences to the family of the individual that was lost at sea on behalf of the entire committee. And on the Coast Guard ship, the Vincent Massey, of course, that docked in St. John's recently. So our deepest condolences to the family and to all that loved that dear individual who served this community. And I'd like to thank everyone that was involved in the search and rescue effort on behalf of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my first question, according to Transport Canada's departmental results report in 2022 and 2023, Transport Canada and Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard aim to remove 110 vessels of concern by March 31st, 2023. What was the percentage of the desired removals that actually got removed in 2023 fiscal year? Let me see who will ask it. Colin? Mr. Hayden?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So my name's Colin Hanine. I'm the Director of Environmental Protection Policy, Marine Protection Policy at Transport Canada. So I'm the policy guy. I'm probably the last guy to answer the question on specific numbers of vessel removals. So maybe I'll pass it to my colleague, Joanne, who'll be able to answer that from the TC side, and then perhaps a colleague from Coast Guard can speak to, Robert Brooks will speak to that from the Coast Guard side.
I'm going to pass it over to Coast Guard to respond to this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Mr. Chair, just to confirm, are we asking for the totals for solely fiscal year 2023?
Fiscal year end 2023, March 31st.
Thank you very much. So within the fiscal year of 2023, we removed 117 vessels that year. And in total, I think as Director General Neem had mentioned, we've removed in total 791 vessels over the course of since 2016.
Okay. So in 2022, $2 billion was promised by the Trudeau Liberal government to renew the Oceans Protection Act. And this is in addition to $1.5 billion that was given out a few years before that. How are you on funds? Do you have enough funds to keep you going in this program, or are you short? Yes.
So, yes, the government has invested over $300 million in a combination between the Oceans Protection and the renewal of the Oceans Protection Plan. During that, since 2016, the Canadian Coast Guard, Transport Canada, and Small Craft Harbors have been able to fully allocate that funding to addressing abandoned and abandoned and wrecked vessels. So we've been able to spend our full allocation every year.
So I'll ask Mr. Hopper, or sorry, Ms. Hopper, and Ms. Weiss-Reed. You can both respond separately. How do you feel the efficiency of the program is? Having to work between two departments. Could it be better? Would it better serve its purposes if it was all under Transport Canada or all under the Canadian Coast Guard, Fisheries and Oceans?
I can start. For our perspective from Small Craft Harbors, the abandoned wrecked vessels removal program, it's going well. We do receive approximately $250,000 a year. We receive applications. We've gone over the objective. I think with the Oceans Protection Program 1.0. The objective was to remove 50 vessels, and we ended up removing 154. We worked directly with the harbor authorities and the applicants, and we've had great success since the beginning of the program. Since the budget 2022, with the Oceans Protection Plan 2.0, the objectives was to try to remove 15 vessels per year, and to date we have removed 41. I'm sure there are always efficiencies to be gained in different areas, but from our perspective, it's been a quite successful program to date.
Transport Canada?
Yep. Thank you for the question. So the Minister of Transport regulates shipping and navigation. We jointly administer the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessels Act with Canadian Coast Guard. Canadian Coast Guard, under their jurisdiction, deal with vessels that are hazardous, and Transport Canada addresses vessels that are abandoned and dilapidated. So we work very closely with the Canadian Coast Guard, nationally and in the regions, to ensure that we address the vessels appropriately within our respective mandates.
So so it looks like you didn't have any projects that were planned that didn't get completed by the sounds of it. Let me see here. Again, Ms. Weiss-Reed, so you indicated that you exceeded your goals. So are you telling us that you're much more efficient with the public purse in this program than you expected to be? Is that possible?
I can't speak to that, but in terms of the objectives, I think when we set out on the program in 2017, because there can be we weren't sure in terms of the number of applications and how all could be managed, but certainly from experience and what we've seen, that we have been quite successful in delivering on and using the full funding that's been provided to us.
Mr. Hardy, for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for everybody for being here. I will not even attempt to direct the question, but if you light up and you know the answer, then please speak up. Can you give us a rough idea, at least, of the ratio of the whole catalog of abandoned derelict vessels? What percentage would be pleasure craft versus, if you like, commercial, everything from fishing boats to small freighters or whatever?
Thank you very much for the question. The national inventory has approximately 1,350 vessels within it today. Roughly speaking, 34% of those that we've removed, we did not know the materials of them. 31% were fishing vessels, 14% were sailing vessels, 9% were pleasure craft, and 8% were motorboats, 1% were barges.
All right, that's okay. But I guess the image that we have on the West Coast, at least, is people, they grow tired of the boat. The boat is tired anyway, and they just leave it somewhere. And the impression that we get, at least on the West Coast, is that the majority of the vessels have been pleasure craft of some sort. Is that a fair assessment?
Thank you again for the question. Within the remaining inventory today, 24% approximately are sailing vessels.
So basically pleasure craft.
Correct, sir.
Yeah, okay. Can anybody speak to the possibility that some of the problems around abandoned and derelict vessels might be related to the, if you like, the devolution of small craft harbors from the federal government to local authorities? Do local authorities face, if you like, an imbalance of the issue that we're trying to deal with here? I'll look up and down the line. You'll all look puzzled. I'm sorry, Ms. Nem, were you...
I'd ask Stephanie Hopper for that one on small craft harbors.
All right.
Yeah, but respectful, like we're responsible for the abandoned and wrecked vessels removal program. They're within the small craft harbors that are under DFO's responsibility. I can't speak to those that are outside of our inventory. But certainly, I would expect that there would be similar issues elsewhere. But whether or not the question in terms of whether it's directly related to having divested small craft harbors in the past, certainly if we have a higher number of harbors, we have specifically divested over 1,100 harbors over the past 30-some years within the program. But I can't speak to whether some of those 1,100 would be experiencing the same challenges in terms of derelict vessels or not.
Well, with respect to Ms. Barron bringing forward the notion to study this, we did look into it, although not in a really official way a few years ago. And I think that this committee needs to probably bring in, some municipal partners in this because I think they're stakeholders. I recall in the testimony that we heard that some of these abandoned vessels become the home for homeless people. That you have that aspect of it. I don't know if anybody on this panel can speak to the degree to which that is still a problem. That if you basically take a derelict vessel away and deal with it, you're making somebody homeless. Is that a factor here?
Thank you very much for the question. Certainly, as we work through the challenges in this area with our colleagues at Transport Canada and Small Craft Harbors, we do see an increasing number of situations where vessels have become liveaboards for people who are facing a homelessness crisis in certain communities.
Time left, Mr. Chair. How many? Oh, lovely. Okay. When we last visited this, one of the biggest challenges of dealing with derelict vessels, and I'm thinking more specifically of pleasure craft, was the issue, the difficulty in dealing with fiberglass. There was very, very few processes available to actually, recycle or break these down. They ended up, I think, just breaking them up, sawing them up, and burying them. Are you aware of any developments in that area, Mr. Henning? You're nodding, so perhaps you can tell us that.
Yes, thanks for the question. Mr. Chair, we know that there are some challenges with fiberglass vessel recycling. There aren't a lot of facilities that will accept them. And when you find a facility that does, sometimes the value of the vessel is actually less than the cost of the recycling. And in addition, the recycling of fiberglass, the challenge is that new fiberglass is seen to be cheaper and of better quality. So that's a bit of an issue. What Transport Canada has done on the R&D side is we did launch an Innovation Solutions Canada Challenge to look into potential solutions for recycling fiberglass vessels. And we had two prototypes that were actually fairly successful. They were either for repurposing the fiberglass into other industrial materials or to reduce them back to their original components so that you could make new fiberglass out of them. We don't, at this time, have a mandate to commercialize that technology. That's with the folks who were participating in the challenge. But certainly, in the future, as R&D funds become available, for example, through the Vessel Remediation Fund, that could be one of the purposes that some of those funds are put to, would be to improving R&D when it comes to fiberglass recycling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll now go to Madame Debienne pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Your presence here is very precious. It's a very broad topic, and it's no surprise that I'll be talking about the St. Lawrence River and all the crafts that go through there. The interpreter is losing sound. We can't hear the speaker. Mr. Chair, could the MP repeat her question? Because we couldn't hear her when she was asking her question.
And Mr. Chair, sorry, I'm just noticing that my microphone is coming up instead of Carolyn, so I keep turning mine off and hers. Anyways, I think there's a bit of a mix-up on the microphones happening as well. So, yeah, I didn't turn it on, just to clarify.
Yeah, okay. I believe you. There's others wouldn't, but I do. Okay, we'll start from the top, Madame Debienne.
OK, je reprends de zéro.
I will start from the beginning. Thank you. Thank you for being here. There we go. No surprise that I will be asking you questions about the St. Lawrence River, the Gulf, and all that has to do with it. I would have liked to know more about who is a specialist in that part of maritime circulation. I just want to put my question to the right person, but it may also depend on the question I'm asking. So the first question, the 24% percentage of pleasure boats versus commercial boats, is it the same proportion that we find in the St. Lawrence River, or is it different on the Pacific side?
Merci pour.
Thank you for your question.
Don't have the details broken down by region, but if Mr. Chair, if possible, we could follow up in writing with those details.
Pas de traduction. Je n'ai pas d'interprétation.
We'll suspend for a moment and just see. It's okay now? Okay. All right. Continue, please.
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question.
That I do not have the specific regional breakdowns to answer that question in detail. Mr. Chair, if it'd be possible to follow up in writing. Thank you.
Ce serait apprécié. Merci. Ça fait.
That would be nice. That's one of my questions that justify the follow-up question. Of course, there are regs that already exist with some risks. There are also potential future risks. And the law that governs all that is the 2019 Act that provides or that is concerning for some pilots. I met the Corporation of Pilots of the St. Lawrence River, and private institutions have less requirements when it comes to French. It is no longer necessary for the pilots of the St. Lawrence River to be assessed, and this is increasing the risks. This risk, is it one of your concerns with the objective of avoiding further disasters and wrecks that are increasing the problem?
Thank you. Sorry, I apologize. My earpiece is not working, but if I understand the question, and thank you, Mr. Chair. As I understand it right now, there is a requirement for proficiency in both French and English for pilotage along the St. Lawrence, that is in the compulsory pilotage zones covered by the Laurentian Pilotage Authority. My understanding is that that's not changing. So I know that there are some concerns that there have been concerns expressed in the past that with the transition of the reform in pilotage that it's changing, but nothing has changed. Sorry. Thank you.
En fait, c'est surtout le fait que
It's mostly the fact that those pilots of St. Lawrence don't need to be present during their certification. So when it comes to assessment of the quality of communication in the St. Lawrence, it's no longer certain. So their presence is no longer required per se. So that's what they told me.
For the question, Mr. Chair, again, my apologies, but if I understand the question, there is a collaborative process. So with the pilotage reforms, the responsibility for the regulation of pilotage passed from the pilotage authorities to Transport Canada. When that transition happened, we essentially just moved the system, the system in its entirety as it existed then over to Transport Canada. We have since then been, and this was in June or July 2022, since then we've been working on establishing collaborative processes with the Laurentian Pilotage Authority, with the shipping associations, and with the Canadian Marine Pilots Association as well, to set up these committees to look at the issue of training and the qualifications. Recognizing that the proficiency is in both official languages is an important element to safety along the St. Lawrence Seaway. But pilotage remains extremely safe in Canada. The numbers, if you look at the incident rates, or it's less than 0.1%, which is to say that 99.9% of all pilotage assignments on the St. Lawrence are successfully completed. So we have yet to see any evidence that that language proficiency has become an issue. And when communicating, and I turn back to the Coast Guard for this one, but when communicating with the pilotage authority and ordering a pilot, it's the langue de votre choix, right? There's no restrictions on the language. And then for marine communication traffic services, it's, yeah.
Même dans la formation privée?
Even with private training?
They're currently so is this about the private pilotage, Mr. Chair? Is this about the private pilotage, the 4 North Shore ports?
En fait, j'ai plus de temps, Monsieur le Président. Hein? Je sais plus là, je suis dépassé. Moi, j'essaie.
I was trying to be brief, but it looks like I've gone beyond my time. This is what we hear at the corporation or at the association. There was an official training. Now you have private foreign transport companies can train their own pilots who do pass assessment tests. So the pilots of the St. Lawrence.
For the question, Mr. Chair, in the case of a pilotage certificate, which is, you can, when you're in a compulsory pilotage zone, you have a choice. You can order a pilot through the Laurentian Pilotage Authority to come aboard and guide your vessel, or if you have a mariner, if your bridge crew on board is sufficiently experienced that they have familiarity that would be at the level of an experienced pilot on a particular origin-destination pairing, they can go through a certification process, which involves an evaluation. That certification process is conducted in the language of their choice, because either language can be used for navigational purposes along the St. Lawrence. So we have yet to hear of any situations where the training is an issue, where the training and the choice of the language of training has become an issue. And we're not looking at varying at this point. We have in the consultations we have held to date, there has been no conversation around the issue of the language of training.
Okay, thank you, Madam Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to say thank you to the translators for all the work that they're doing. First of all, I'm very happy to have everybody here. I'm thankful to my colleagues for agreeing to bring forward this important study. I will say that this is an issue that is really important to constituents, but also to Canadians across the country. As you know better than I do, the issue is different depending on where you are in Canada, but it very much is a very prominent issue across Canada in general. However, on the West Coast, we know that the issue is we have many more vessels on the West Coast. Now, I'm going down a rabbit hole of things I didn't want to start talking about yet. The first thing I just wanted to talk about is, first of all, is it Ms. Naim, or what's the title that you prefer?
Ms. Naim's fine.
Ms.? Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't, that I was giving you the right title there. Ms. Naim, I believe, you're out on the water, are you not? Are you seeing these vessels firsthand through the chair?
So we, at the Canadian Coast Guard, we have 248 employees dedicated to our Marine Environmental and Hazard Response Program that is spread regionally across the country and in headquarters. Sorry, I have the breakdown.
The reason why I'm asking, just because I have a lot of questions I want to get to, sorry, is just to get an understanding of what it is that we're talking about here. Myself, I was out in a kayak recently along the coast of Vancouver Island, which is where my constituency is, and we have now what locals are calling vessel graveyards, where we're seeing clusters of vessels that are being abandoned, and they're leaking fuels, oils, plastics. I saw batteries, I saw barbecues, paint cans. The pollutants that were seeping into the surrounding marine ecosystem were just horrific to see. And so I'm wondering if you could speak just very briefly to what implications that has, because it's more important for us to hear it from you. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. So what I can say is that there is great variety across the country in terms of the issues at play. As the single window for the Government of Canada, every request or every notification we receive of a vessel that may be posing a hazard is assessed by the Canadian Coast Guard, and with the determination, with a view to determine whether there are immediate hazards that need to be addressed immediately, whether to protect human health and safety or the environment.
Thank you. Thank you. So I guess, some of the things that I'm seeing firsthand, and I'm sure Canadian Coast Guards are seeing firsthand, are the impacts on food security, the surrounding marine ecosystem, the wildlife, foods, there's endless implications of this. And I think I'm just going to ask some more questions specific to what it is that you're referencing here. A couple of things. So the stats I have, 2016 to 2023, we know that across Canada, for every 3 vessels that were added to the registry, there was only 1 removed. Now, in British Columbia, we know that there have been 5 vessels for every 1, so that number is much higher. And I have all these different charts and numbers that show various, regions and how many are being cleaned up, how many are being added, how many are unknown. There's all these different stats we can look at. But one trend that we can see is that the amount of vessels that are being abandoned by far outnumber the amount of vessels that are being cleaned up. And so despite the work of so many people who are out on the water doing their best, to be clear, clearly there's a gap somewhere. And so I'm wondering what you see as some of the gaps in why we're not able to keep up with the vessels that are being abandoned. And then next question I'd like to know around the prevention side of it, but perhaps we could focus on this first.
So on the response side of things, we do prioritize vessels based on the highest risk. And so we do have a risk methodology that does help us identify which vessels need to be addressed first to mitigate further hazards. The variables that we do consider that do determine action are the location, the condition, the size, the construction material, the type and volume pollutants on board, all influence our ability to respond and as well the complexity of the response. We do follow our methodology in the Canadian Coast Guard is because often we are working in multi-jurisdictional areas, that we do collaborative responses so that anybody who has an authority or responsibility specific to the vessel is included in the contingency planning and the response measures, so that we do include those individuals as well to make sure we are maximizing and leveraging everybody's responsibilities and authorities to mitigate the risks that are posed by the specific
Thank you.
vessel.
Do you feel, through the chair, that you have the capacity, and perhaps if you're not the best person, somebody else I'm happy to answer as well, but do you feel that there's the capacity to actually meet the need of the vessels that are out there? Because what I'm hearing from people, mariners, people in coastal communities, First Nations, I have images of the damages in front of me, that's why I was looking over there. What I'm hearing directly is that there are circumstances where it's clear that the threshold of when the vessel is abandoned of what the threshold is too high. And so, for example, speaking to one local, there was a boat right off the coast of Vancouver Island that was abandoned. It was leaking oil. It clearly needed to be cleaned up. Because that threshold wasn't high enough, it sat there for a long time. They were looking for the owners. It was a long, convoluted process. It sunk. They cleaned it up. And then in the amount of time that they were still looking for the owners and the threshold wasn't high enough, it sunk again. Then they had to clean it up again. It just seems like a really inefficient system that's causing a lot of damage to the surrounding marine ecosystem. So do you feel that there is the infrastructure and investment in place to ensure that the vessels that are needed to be cleaned up are able to be cleaned up?
Thank you very much for the question. Mr. Chair, what I can say is that since 2016, as my colleague Ms. Nim has referenced, the government has invested over $300 million to deal with this issue. Within the scope of responsibilities through our reporting systems, when there is a case that's reported to the Canadian Coast Guard, we will assess that vessel for risk and respond accordingly. When there is an emergency response required, the Canadian Coast Guard's focus is always on incident stabilization to remove pollutants, secure the vessel to the greatest extent possible, and monitor. As we know, Canada operates on a polluter pay principle, and we look to owners for their responsibilities to be met. And in certain cases, it does take some time to work through that continuum with owners to ensure that they're meeting their responsibilities.
We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each of the guests for being here today. We really appreciate you taking the time and informing us. And to the members of the Canadian Coast Guard, want to say once again, as my colleague Mr. Small stated, our sincere condolences to the family and to all the members of the Canadian Coast Guard. Oftentimes, people do not perhaps take into consideration the risk that is involved in the service that you do provide. But boys, oh boys, those vessels that are on the water that are in trouble or in a really tough situation, it's the Canadian Coast Guard that's first and foremost on their minds. So I want to thank you for what you do, and our thoughts and prayers with the family of the member who has passed. So I wanted to just say that right away. But we've heard some stats and some information about how much is being accomplished so far. From what we're hearing, you feel like you're on track to achieve the objectives within budget and on time, or am I misunderstanding that, or do I have a correct understanding of that? Like if you were to assess it, and I don't know if that's to the Coast Guard or also to the department, do you feel like you are within budget and on time in meeting the objectives of the amount of abandoned vessels that have been identified that need to be addressed?
Question. What I can say is that as we collect the information in the inventory and we do our risk assessments, we do prioritize based on risks, but what we also do is multi-year planning, and we regularly reevaluate the list of vessels that are in the queue to be remediated or removed to ensure that as the risk profile changes, we are able to adjust our operations to continue to address the risks. What I can also say is that although we have been in addition to the funding that we have been allocated, there are mechanisms in place that if we are faced with an issue where there is a vessel posing a significant risk and immediate hazard, there are mechanisms in place for us to access additional funding if and when required to ensure that the hazards presented by that vessel are addressed promptly and efficiently.
So you feel like you're adequately resourced, and it's just a matter of establishing the priorities, of course, based on risk to the environment and surrounding areas of community. Can you enlighten us a little bit further on how you establish the priority vessels to make sure, like what the process is, to make sure those that are at the most risk of causing the most harm
to our waters and to our communities are addressed in an efficient and expeditious manner. Can you speak to that as well?
Thank you very much for the question. As my colleague, Ms. Nim, has referenced, we have a risk assessment methodology in the Canadian Coast Guard that looks at a number of variables. We look at the risk and hazard that a vessel could pose from an environmental perspective, risk to the economic considerations within the local area. We look at risks to public safety, human health. So it's a broad spectrum of risk. Each year within the allocations that we have to allocate to these vessels, we have an annual planning cycle where experts within the Canadian Coast Guard come together. We evaluate the national inventory, bring out the vessels that have had a risk assessment done to them, and we look at them in terms of where they rank in that risk score. And then together, through that committee of experts, we come up with a peer-reviewed list, and we challenge each other from coast to coast in each region to make sure that we're allocating the funds that we have to the highest priorities that we're aware of at the time.
Very good. Thank you. In regards to jurisdictions, my question on this is important because I know sometimes there's provincial areas of jurisdiction, there's federal areas of jurisdiction, then you have the differences between coastal community, and then also we have some inshore situations, or what I could say, inland lakes and water systems that have derelict and neglected vessels that need to be addressed. How is that going, and do you have a clear process to make sure that jurisdictional concerns are being addressed? Is it a collaborative approach with the provincial areas of authority or regional authorities? And what do you see as the biggest challenges or impediments to that?
Thank you very much for the question. Generally speaking, what I can say is that the Canadian Coast Guard works very closely with a range of partners, both federally, provincially, municipally, and with nations, Indigenous nations across the country. The process by which we works effectively, and we're able to access our alerting networks to make sure that partners are notified. We're able to come together as required on scene through our incident command system, and when required to respond to a large incident, we'll have an incident command post to make sure that partners are up to speed and fully able to contribute their authorities and mandates to resolve the issues.
Thank you, Mr. Bragdon. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, follow up on Mr. Bragdon. Who explained the jurisdictional line between the Federal Department of Transport and DFO in relation to abandoned vessels? Who?
Canadian Coast Guard, I'll start with us, is responsible for any vessel that presents a hazard that requires immediate attention. Small Craft Harbors is responsible for the implementation of WAVA for anything within its boundaries of a small craft harbor, and Transport Canada is responsible for vessel abandonment, irresponsible ownership, and dilapidated vessels.
Okay. It's not really clear. Doesn't seem clear of who. So my next question is, could you identify for the committee, is there any known abandoned vessels, derelict, that are a threat to fish habitat?
Thank you very much for the question. What I can say is that with respect to the risk assessment methodology that we employ at the Canadian Coast Guard with our partners at Transport, the vessels that we do remediate and are hazardous may in fact pose those threats. As
those currently in waters on both coasts?
Just trying to think about the details on that.
Well, if you don't have it, that's fair. If you could report back to the committee, through the committee, through the clerk of the chair. I want to know what the current status is on both coasts as it relates to abandoned vessels that have a potential to harm the fishery environment, the fish stock environment. Because if some other vessel runs into it, that's a different issue. We're the fishery committee. So if you could, and not a minor one, it has to be a significant one, which would be some of the content on the vessel. It would be either the fuel on it or some of the cargo that was being carried. So how many of those that are currently existing and are being monitored by somebody?
Okay. The other one, if you could, Mr. Chair, through you, you referenced since 2016 investment. What existed before 2016?
Well, we had our marine environmental response pollution program, and we were able to address vessels that were posing a threat to ship source oil pollution or mystery spills. So
The department always had a capability.
environmental response capability.
No, but I'm referencing removal capability, getting the deck out. Was there anything that existed before 2016?
Thank you very much for the question. To expand upon Ms. Nibb's answer, yes, the Canada Shipping Act, Part 8, provides authorities for the minister to take action to repair or remedy.
Was there a budgetary item in DFO as it existed now?
Maybe what I could say is that under the Ocean Protection Plan, it was the first time that the Canadian Coast Guard had dedicated resources to remediate and assess hazardous vessels specifically. However, previously, under the Canada Shipping Act...
And what was the number again that you had beginning in 2016 to finally take action on these? What was the number? What is the number?
Pardon me, can you clarify, Mr. Chair,
The
the
Ocean
figure?
Protection Program that came in 2016. What was the value? What was the amount?
Oh. Ms. Nibb, do you have that number?
Because what you're telling me, you had none, there was no money before. No targeted budget existed to tackle the problem.
$139.8 million.
Okay.
In
that's fine.
2016.
I
and then
just want
we
to
got-
record, there was no, the government of Canada did not dedicate any resources to this, this particular problem prior to 2016. Thank you. So I'm surprised, it's under the Small Craft Harbor Authority. Why is it under the Small Craft Harbor Authority? Or Small Craft, yeah, it's under Small Craft Harbors Authority.
Ms. Hopper for that one.
And I know I'm out of time.
We have the abandoned and wrecked vessels removal program is specific to small craft harbors that are owned by DFO. So we have a specific program within the Oceans Protection Program.
Okay, excuse me, it would only be in that particular, it would have to be in a small craft harbor, the abandoned vessel, for you to deal with it? Am I correct?
For small craft harbors, yes.
Okay, thanks, Chair, I'm over.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair. I will try to speak to Ms. Verville, who may speak French. Do you have a perspective that allows you to believe that security on the St. Lawrence, the maritime traffic for dangerous material has stayed the same, has improved, or there are more challenges than before? Thank you for the question. I would like to refer that question to my colleagues from Transport Canada because it's under their purview.
OK. Non, ça marche.
OK.
Merci pour la
Parce que
question.
là, j'ai 2 minutes et demie. Je sais
No,
plus où je suis
just,
rendue.
I'll try to be rapid. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Marine transportation is still one of the safest methods of transportation that exists in Canada. With the marine traffic levels are increasing all the time. We have not seen any noticeable uptick in incidents or marine incidents, accidents, or occurrences that would lead us to believe that the system is becoming any less safe than it was before. So.
À cet égard, vous...
In that regard, you have not heard about any of the concerns expressed by the pilots of the St. Lawrence when it comes to private training? You haven't heard anything about that?
I think, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think the system that exists currently within the regulations, in terms of granting, I think what we're talking about is pilotage certificates. The system that exists with respect to the training and certification of bridge crew in order to receive a pilotage certificate is intended to ensure the same level of safety as a licensed marine pilot, that is someone who's a full-time pilot. The level of experience required in terms of sea time as a captain or as a member of the bridge crew, the experience that's required in terms of the number of transits, in terms of the familiarity with the current conditions. Ça dépend de la situation, Mr. Chair. The number of trips required to qualify for a pilotage certificate will depend on the particular origin and destination pairing in accordance with the level of risk to navigational safety. But those transits are set in order to ensure that the experience level that a licensed pilot would have would be equivalent to the bridge crew operating that vessel. And it's really based on the principle that someone who conducts the same transit over many years would have the same level of knowledge and experience as a marine pilot would with respect to the licensed pilot. So that is the bridge crew. In some sense, the experience and the knowledge of the bridge crew would be equivalent to that of a licensed marine pilot, and therefore they can apply for a certificate. But the certificate only applies to a very specific set of origin and destination pairings. So they don't become a licensed pilot themselves eligible to navigate anywhere in the St. Lawrence. It's only a pilotage certificate is only valid for leaving a port for a certain port of origin and a certain destination. So.
Thank you, Madam Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Small for 2.5 minutes or less, please. Ms. Barron. Ms. Small.
Oh. What is happening here?
I'll certainly apologise to Ms. Barron for calling her Ms. Small.
Just because we're both goofies doesn't mean...
Yeah.
It's the Newfoundland bond. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as we know, it is much less expensive for us to prevent these vessels from being abandoned in the first place. And right now we have systems that are in place that people are unsure how to properly dispose their vessel. They're unsure what to do once their vessel has reached the life that a vessel goes through. And so we need to have a bigger strategy in place. But one thing in particular that I wanted to ask about was the identification of vessel owners. I've heard from a constituent recently who was frustrated. He kept going in circles. He was trying to actually register his vessel, and he had been working on this for months and could not get a clear answer as to how to register his vessel. And I'm wondering if somebody could share with me the challenges around registering vessels and how that is an important piece of this discussion on how to clean up these vessels and prevent them from sinking in the first place.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We do actually, I work in Marine Safety and Security, in the Marine Safety and Security Program at Transport Canada. We regularly receive emails to the Minister and to others from individuals who are experiencing trouble with the online registration system. You can also use mail as well. I'm happy to follow up with the Senator after this meeting to take down the particulars of the individual and provide them with the information that'll help them get their pleasure craft registered. So.
I have provided that information to him, just to let you know, and I'd be happy to talk about it later through the chair. But the bigger issue here is not just around the registration of the vessel, but being able to access the information around the registration of the vessel. I'm being told that when a vessel is abandoned, that in order to clean it up, the vessel owner needs to be identified, and there's huge delays that the system's outdated in being able to identify the owner in a timely manner, which means the vessel sits longer than it needs to, polluting into the surrounding marine ecosystem. So I'm wondering if somebody could speak to the implications of an outdated registration system, or in fact, if that's accurate.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the Marine Safety Program is responsible for the operation of the Pleasure Craft Licensing Database. One of the issues that we have seen is that prior to 2010, a license, which is actually the permit, which is essentially similar to a vehicle permit that you have for the car that you own. They were granted on a lifetime basis, and the onus was on the owner to report into the database when the vessel ownership changed hands, or if they were decommissioning the vessel and rendering it for disposal. That was not always the case. So in 2010, we implemented a 10-year time limit, for the validity of that licensing, with the hopes that over time we would see sort of the existing lifetime licenses slowly kind of grandfathered or transitioning into a 10-year license. What happened is that since then we've seen about there's about a total of 2.7 million licenses in the system. There are still 1.5 million lifetime licenses. Those licenses go back as far as the 1960s and could involve individuals that have since passed on, or vessels that have since passed through 2 or 3 different owners. So as a result, we are in the process of updating the regulations, of amending the regulations to create a 5-year permit lifetime, or a period of validity period of 5 years for pleasure craft licenses. And an individual would have, I think it is 30 days to report a change in ownership to the licensing database. That is designed to create a stronger licensing regime to support the operation of the wrecked and hazardous and abandoned vessels legislation, to enable the identification for the individuals in the Navigation Protection Program or in the Canadian Coast Guard, to allow them to more readily identify who the owner is of a vessel. And that is, it's to the example that's probably been being brought up is if it's the case that an abandoned vessel, that the registration information in the licensing database is not up to date, then it can sometimes be next to impossible to track down the last owner of that vessel.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Calkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to be back at the Fisheries Committee, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to ask some questions. Just so I'm clear, based on the presentation, Ms. Neem, that you said, I just want to make sure I've got the information correctly in my mind. You said that $300 million has been used in the removal of derelict and abandoned vessels. Do I have that correct?
Invested since 2016, and that money extends to 2027.
So that's invested?
Yeah.
So that's spent? It's money that has been spent, correct?
Some
Not
of it has
budgeted.
been spent, but
Well, how much has been spent, please?
I'd have to add up the columns. I just need a minute to do that.
So it hasn't all been spent?
No.
Okay, and that program goes until when?
There are some elements to it that are ongoing and some that expire in 2027.
Okay. The number of vessels that I have is 1,489 units in June and 1,358 in September of 2024. That's a net of 131 vessels less. The claim is 791 vessels removed. If you've used the entire $300 million, which you say you haven't, that would work out to $380,000 per vessel. That seems exorbitant to me. How much money have you collected from the owners in the user pay principle? How much has been reimbursed to the taxpayer?
Pardon me? Yeah, so I think to answer your question, I would turn to my colleague from Transport to talk about the Vessel Remediation Fund.
Sure. Mr. Chair, the Vessel Remediation Fund is a future source of long-term funding that would be owner-financed, that will enable us to not be drawing on general taxpayer revenues to address the costs of remediation when we cannot find the owner or when the owner is unwilling or unable to
That's fine. That's fine. I understand the intention. My question is very specific. How much money have we collected from the owners of derelict vessels? I'm just looking for a number if you have one. If you don't have one, that's fine.
We'd have to follow up in writing, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. And I also heard, I don't remember who said it specifically, I heard somebody say that the number of vessels that are being added to the inventory is increasing at an almost, what I understood it to be almost exponential rate. Can that be confirmed? Like we're seeing more going in than ever before. Is that right? Maybe that was Ms. Barron asking the question. Is that actually true?
Thank you very much for the question. What I can say is that the creation of the national inventory was a direct measure in response to the investments that were made through the Ocean Protection Plan. As we embarked on that adventure to record and build this inventory, we have seen an increase in the trend of vessels being entered into the inventory, in particular between 2018 and 19 to 2023-24. We saw that big data entry into the inventory as we were discovering the cases.
That $300 million allocation, when was that first budgeted?
The $300 million that has been referenced thus far is the investment that's been targeted to Canadian Coast Guard transport and small craft harbors.
What year?
That's since 2016.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is that the government has made an announcement that they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up derelict vessels, and I'm also hearing you say that there's more derelict vessels than ever. Would it be fair to say that vessel owners on the coast now believe that the government will actually clean up these vessels, and that's why there's more derelict vessels? Is the program actually creating more derelict vessels because people say, well, the government's going to pay to clean it up? Is that the problem?
Maybe it'd be helpful, Mr. Chair, I'll speak to the overall strategy on wrecked and abandoned vessels, which really has 5 pillars that we're working through. We had to establish the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessels Act. We had to develop this national inventory and risk assessment methodology, which the Coast Guard is talking about vessels coming onto, and which is the source of this, number of vessels coming on versus number of vessels coming off. That's kind of a counting system. And that allowed us to put in place some short-term funding to start addressing and removing these vessels from the list. But
sounds like you built a lot of process. How much have you spent on bureaucracy versus actually removing vessels of that $300 million that's been spent so far?
I don't have the numbers in front of me of what the policy spending would be on versus the vessel removal spending. I don't know if my colleagues would have those numbers available. But our intention is to be able to better identify the owners so that we're able to hold them responsible for their own vessels and only be spending government money when it comes to vessel owners that are not able to be identified. And then, as well, the final pillar of this strategy is to set up this vessel owner finance fund so that it will be vessel owners who are contributing to the costs of removing these vessels.
Thank you, Mr. Coggins. Your time is up.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me share our condolences here with respect to the individual that lost their life on the Vincent Massey. When that happens, everyone in the Coast Guard feels it. So my condolences to the family and the friends, the colleagues, and back home in Sydney, in Westmount, is where the Canadian Coast Guard College resides. Most of those individuals that were on any vessel received their training there, and I know the cadets feel it. And I know the instructors feel it. So my condolences to everyone. And thank you for coming here today. It seems, one of the great benefits of being, the last to ask questions in a particular round is that there's a lot of great questions that are asked around process and a lot around investment. And one of the recurring themes that I hear is that substantial investments have been made over the years with respect to focusing on abandoned and derelict vessels, which I think is critical and key. And so I appreciate that, and it seems to be having an impact, which is really good. So the instructor in me or leadership instructor in me, when I'm looking at organizations or I'm looking at processes that are designed to help alleviate, solve a problem, is that there are things that you're doing exceptionally well. And I'd like to know, for example, what could enhance the job that each one of you and your departments do? To even enhance this further. That'd be one. I'm going to try to get in another question. So think about that and who's best to answer it. The other one is more of a micro question, but I think really, really important. One of the things that I've heard from time and time again is that an individual that owns a vessel or a company that owns a vessel, if they go belly up, if a company goes belly up, and the vessel is there and they're a lot of elements to the vessel that need to be taken care of, whether it be chemicals, so forth and so on. How do we approach that particular scenario when there isn't a particular owner that is that owns a vessel? They may be out of business. They may be somewhat maybe trying to remove themselves from that particular process to own up to an owner's responsibility. So maybe if we could start there, and please, on the first question and then the second question, if I have time, I'll ask a third one.
So our colleagues for the first part and maybe Madame Verville for the second part.
So what I would say is that the two main gaps that we're trying to fill right now in the wrecked, abandoned, and hazardous vessels national strategy are the two regulatory pieces that are to come. So we spoke about putting into place the Act. That's been done. We've talked about the vessel, the national inventory and the risk methodology. That's underway. We've talked about short-term funding to start getting vessels out of the water. That is underway. Where we are now is those vessel owner improvements that my colleague was speaking to a few moments ago to bring down that period of time so we'll have more accurate information as to who the owners are. And then once we have that piece in place, we're able to then go to the build this vessel remediation fund, which is part of the Act, and which is going to allow us to have a stable funding base with owners contributing to this fund through a regulatory charge each time they register their pleasure craft, or they license their pleasure craft, or they register their vessel in the vessel registry. We'll be in a position to have a regulatory charge so that those folks are contributing to vessel remediations, but also to some of the more proactive pieces that we've been talking about, like public education, for example, or research and development, or local capacity building, or even vessel turn-in programs. So that's really the gaps that we're trying to work through in the system, is to actually give effect to the vision of this strategy, which is still in the process of being rolled out. And I'll pass it to my Coast Guard colleagues for the second part.
La priorité de la garde côtière.
The priority of the Canadian Coast Guard will always be hold owners responsible for their boats and have them use it in a responsible manner at the end of their life cycles. Now, about the fund that will soon be implemented, if damage is caused by oil, claims can be sent to the ship's source oil pollution fund, so that cost could be reimbursed. It's not Canadians that are paying for that in those circumstances.
So I appreciate the answers, and I'll yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm seeking some clarification from Mr. Brooks. Transport Canada's departmental results report in 2022 and 2023, would you say that's a reliable report, Mr. Brooks?
Mr. Chair, I can't comment on the reliability of the report. I would assume it's a report to Parliament, and therefore I would leave it at that.
So I would assume it's a report that ties in the work that the Canadian Coast Guard and Transport Canada are doing jointly on this file. Would you say that's correct, Mr. Brooks?
Mr. Chair, without the report in front of me, I'm not able to confirm the statement.
What was the number of vessels that you stated to me earlier for fiscal year 2022, 2023 that were removed again?
Mr. Chair, if I could make a clarification, my apologies. I had previously used the figure of 117 vessels. However, I misunderstood the question. That was for 2023-24. The vessels removed 2022-23 that I have, the number is 160.
Okay, so, Mr. Chair, there's quite the discrepancy here, because according to Transport Canada's own report, only 27 vessels of concern were addressed under both departments' programs that year. And their goal was to remove 110 vessels. And compared to the rosy picture that's been painted here today, Mr. Chair, The actual fact is that in that fiscal year, we don't have the results for the year just behind us here, but the percentage goal achieved was only 25%. Just 27 out of 110 vessels of concern were removed. So, yeah, I might have seemed a little bit shaken because I was a little bit thrown there by Mr. Brooks on that answer that he gave me. So, how much of the budget projection was used in fiscal 22-23 of the 41.6 million that's shared between both departments?
Mr. Chair, we would have to follow up with the precise details. Thank you.
Okay, so I've got it from that same report. It was 25.2 million, which represents 61% of the proposed spend, and it yielded 25% of the desired outcomes. I'm not sure that this program is working as well as my colleague, Mr. Morrissey, said it was. So, how many projects were planned in 2022 and 2023 that didn't get done? Do you know the names of the projects that you had in mind for that fiscal year? Do you have a list of them? If you can't provide them here now, you can provide them in writing.
Mr. Chair, we'd be happy to follow up specifically with that. Maybe I could offer a clarification that may assist. Perhaps the numbers that you're referring to in the Transport Canada report were focused on the abandoned boat program, which was one component of the funding that was allocated to all departments, and therefore it may not be comprehensive and include all of the vessels removed by the Canadian Coast Guard, small craft harbors, and transport as a total effort.
So my next question again to Mr. Brooks is what progress has been made on removing the remaining 83 vessels of concern since the 31st of March 2023, the ones that didn't get removed, that were a part of the failed goal? Do you know how many of those that have since been removed?
Mr. Chair, I would ask my colleagues at Transport Canada to speak to that specifically because I do believe it is part of the abandoned boats program that we're speaking about.
Mr. Chair, in terms of the vessels planned for removal, I'd have to get back to you in writing on that. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
14 seconds, so I'd say it's not long enough for you to get out of the question.
I'm proud.
You're so glad, aren't you?
Someone's happy.
We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can use his 14 seconds. Good. Thank you very much. So I spent part of my career with BC's public auto insurer, and there are some similarities in, kind of tracing ownership and tracing vehicles between vessels and cars and trucks. Is there the equivalent of a vehicle identification number on a boat when it's manufactured?
Good question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's what the pleasure craft license is. The terminology is perhaps a bit of a misnomer, but the pleasure craft license is effectively a registration number, and those are the numbers that you often see on both sides of a vessel, five or 6 digits long.
Those numbers are not actually affixed, like etched into the hull of the vessel. Is that correct? Where I'm going with this is very simple. After dealing with a lot of difficulties with chop shops and vehicle registration numbers being, reallocated to other vehicles, the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia came up with a system that basically, first of all, required the manufacturers to have hidden vehicle identification numbers so that it wasn't easy for somebody to actually scrub the identity of whoever owned that vehicle. Secondly, there's, the licensing needs to be, and I'm sorry, I'm getting into recommendations here, but it sounds like you guys are, pardon the expression, at sea on this issue of trying to identify the people who actually owned the boats that are found, abandoned. But there should be insurance. Insurance on these vehicles should be mandatory, right? And with a license that represents the insurance policy, and that the only way to pass that vessel from one person to another is to relinquish the license, have a new one issued, make sure that the provincial sales tax is paid, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know, we went through this discussion with you guys a few years ago, and it sounds like the issue of trying to identify owners, like nothing has changed since then. But now's your opportunity to tell me I'm wrong on that one.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, that is the intent of the current regulatory amendments to the pleasure craft licensing, to small vessel regulations with respect to pleasure craft licensing. It will create AMPs. It will create a mandatory requirement where one didn't exist before to report change in ownership to the database. It will eventually result in the transition away from lifetime licenses, which is part of the issue with respect to tracing the owner in the first place. And the creation of a 5-year validity period, or a period of validity where you have to renew your license every 5 years, is meant to get at some of these issues that the senator has asked.
What does it cost to basically, not abandon, but to decommission, say, the average pleasure craft? So somebody wants to do the right thing. They've got this boat that's come to the end of its natural life cycle. They want to dispose of it in a responsible way. Do we know what that costs?
Significant. I would offer that price varies significantly.
So you can see that there's obviously a huge incentive to just basically beach it somewhere and walk away, and especially if there's no real way that has been put in place yet to trace back the owner.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We understand the current shortcomings of the way the pleasure craft licensing database is operating, and that's one of the reasons why we put forward these regulatory amendments to try and close some of these gaps.
When can we see some resolution to this?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Canada Gazette, the regulations went to Canada Gazette Part 1 were published in Canada Gazette Part 1 back on May 13th, 2023. Because of the nature of the regulatory changes that were being proposed, we received close to over 800 comments. We are in the process of going through those comments because of some of the changes that are being proposed. We're in the process of going through those comments, and our forward regulatory plan on the Transport Canada website has a tentative date for publication of the final regulations by December.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Monsieur le Président, my tall.
I'm deeply offended now.
Yeah.
Okay. Big week, huh? J'aimerais savoir.
I would like to know, any of you can answer, of the 183 wrecks that have been identified, which of them are identified as posing a hazardous risk?
We'll have to come back with the details, Mr. Chair, in writing.
Est-ce qu'il y a une...
Is any operation going on in the St. Lawrence or in Quebec to find out the vessels that have those hazardous materials that could be identified?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Within how the Canadian Coast Guard operates in the St. Lawrence and in the Gulf, we are continually available to receive reports of hazardous vessels or vessels of concern that are posing a pollution risk or another hazardous nature. That service is available 365 days a year, 24/7. In particular, there are no specific cases that I'm aware of which we have planned operations right now in those regions to remove vessels at this time.
Donc, on ne sait pas.
So we don't know.
I would say we do know. Within the inventory, we have not prioritized in our action plan to remove a vessel specifically in the St. Lawrence at this point, in this year.
OK. Et qu'adviendrait-il si...
And what will happen if, by chance, a diver were to discover a vessel suspected of containing dangerous material? What will happen?
Thank you very much for the question. Mr. Chair, what would happen is in all cases where the Canadian Coast Guard receives a report of a vessel that's posing a concern, we have an assessment process which will be followed, and the duty officer that receives that call will make the determination on whether or not an emergency response is required. If so, the Canadian Coast Guard will respond on an emergency basis 24/7, 365 days a year.
Vous avez quand même...
Thank you, Madam
okay,
Debian.
merci.
There's only 8 seconds left,
C'est
not
bon.
enough to get a question or an answer in. So we'll go on now to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Chair. First question, I believe, would be best suited to transport, to whoever's the best fit. I'm trying to figure out, so as we've talked about already, this is a big issue. There's so much we could talk about around the prevention, to have the systems and mechanisms in place to avoid the vessels being abandoned in the first place. However, it is illegal to abandon a vessel. And I know one fine went to a vessel at southern Vancouver Island, where I live. There was another one on the East Coast. I had information just recently that there were 5 fines totaling, across Canada, totaling $55,500. Now, when I looked on the same database this morning, that number changed to 2 fines that had been given out to owners of vessels that had abandoned their vessels, totaling $26,600. And I don't know why we would see a discrepancy, or even worse, less fines from today than I saw just a few weeks ago. And I'm wondering if somebody can provide some reflections on what's going on.
En lien avec cette question.
I can help you with that question. Transport Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard has separate authorities for pecuniary administrative penalties. Transport Canada can give 2 of such penalties, and the Coast Guard has issued 5 under the Act.
L'origine de...
Maybe that's where the confusion comes from.
How much do we know about how much it costs to clean up a vessel? Does anybody have that information? I guess it depends on the size, but let's say a average-sized pleasure craft on the West Coast.
Thank you very much for the question. The range in cost to address hazardous wrecked or abandoned vessels very much depends on a number of factors, including its location, the state of the vessel, is it sunk, is it partially sunk, is it floating, the size, as well as the construction of the hull and the material that it has, as well as the volume of pollutants on board. What we can say is that in our experience, when the Canadian Coast Guard intervenes to address these vessels that require our attention, we see a range that could be as little as $5,000 to $10,000, but when you get into the commercial vessels that deal with significant pollutants and large size, you could be in the range of $25 to $35 million to remove the vessel and dismantle it. That's right.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon for... No, he's given his time to Mr. Calkins. I apologise for that. For 5 minutes or less, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I do want to pursue that, Mr. Brooks. Can you explain to the committee what we're actually responsible for when it comes to removing a vessel, a derelict vessel, from the water? Are we simply responsible for getting it on land, taking it to a landfill? can you explain to me what the process is that's been set up that the taxpayers are paying for when it comes to, it sounds to me like we've got to dismantle and cut everything up, and can you, surely to goodness there's scrap then, if we're dealing with metal, we're going to get some money back. Can you explain to me what we're all responsible for?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and I'll do my best. Under the Coast Guard's mandate to address wrecked, abandoned, hazardous vessels, we maintain response officers across the country who are responsible for deploying to an incident site. They have the training required to undertake initial risk assessments to understand the nature and risk of the vessel. They also have the training required to deploy any pollution countermeasures required during that initial incident stabilization and to protect the marine environment while plans are made. When we move to take action to deconstruct a vessel, that is not a skill set that is within the Canadian Coast Guard. Therefore, we work with our colleagues at PSPC for a contract to hire professional salvers to deal with the deconstruction.
And you're saying some of these cases is $25 million per vessel?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. We've had cases where we've remediated vessels in that range, including the Catherine Spirit, which was in the Beauharnois region in Montreal. We've also had experience in remediating bulk oil out of the Manolis L, which is a vessel currently sunk in the Fogo Island, and we saw costs in that range as well. Previously to that, we had an estimated cost of $25 million to remove oil from the Zelinsky, which is in the Grenville Channel.
Yeah, but these are just a few, I mean, the vast majority of derelict vessels, you said 25, you said yourself, what, 25% are sailboats, is that right? I think that was the number. And a 30-foot sailboat on average brand new is a $100,000, $100,000 to $150,000 brand new purchase. Of course, that vessel wouldn't be worth that. So when you're making your triage, when you're doing a triage, there's environmental considerations and so on, but surely to goodness there's some low-hanging fruit and some easy things that are not that hard and not that expensive. Is that a consideration when we're talking about removing some of these vessels?
Thank you for the question. There's no question, as the Canadian Coast Guard looks at our list of priorities, we follow our risk assessment process to ensure that we are allocating our money to the highest risk vessels. And so that is the basis upon which we take action.
That's good to know. Since 2015, the budget in 2015 for Department of Fisheries and Oceans was $1.9 billion. That budget has gone up continuously since 2016 to the point where had we continued with the $1.9 billion all the way through, the department has had an extra $13.3 billion in the last 9 budgets. That would have been enough to probably rebuild every small craft harbor in the nation, and it certainly should have been enough to remove every derelict vessel that we have. And I'm wondering, as a taxpayer, and as taxpayers are looking at this, what have we got to show for it on the derelict vessel file? We've only got 791 vessels removed. What is the estimate of the number of vessels? You have a count right now, but I'm sure you haven't. Have you done a full count on all of Canada's coastal waters that we're responsible for? Or is there still vast areas that still need to have an inventory taken?
Thank you very much for the question. The national inventory is an evergreen inventory of vessels, and so that number that's within the inventory can change quite often as vessels are reported to the Canadian Coast Guard. Not all vessels that are reported that actually make their way into the inventory end up being hazardous, wrecked, or abandoned in terms of the definitions. And so as we move through that assessment to do that quality assurance check and make sure that we are identifying risk, there are some vessels that we do remove from the inventory because they do not meet the threshold.
Can you confirm how many more employees work for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans now in 2024 than were in employment in 2015? How many more staff cumulatively? Does anybody know?
Follow up in writing, Mr. Chair.
Correct. Mr. Cochins, your time is up. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. A question of clarification. You're saying that owners are responsible to remove the abandoned vessels and so on and so forth. I think this question has been asked, but I just want to be certain. The number of owners who take action and cover the cost for removing those vessels versus the others. Do you have the number? Was that clarified? Is it because the numbers are not compiled or they are not available simply? The priority for the Canadian Coast Guard is to work in collaboration with the owners so that they themselves take necessary measures. Those statistics are not compiled when the owners themselves have their own obligations under the law and take the necessary actions. If in a given year 100 abandoned vessels are removed from the water, there's no compilation, whether it's the owner or the company that paid or the government. The statistics that Mr. Brooks gave you, well, it's certain that Transport Canada or small crafts have taken some measures to come up with the statistics. Why is no account kept? I can't answer the question. Do you think it's important at least to have someone take care of the statistics to know what the costs are and compare that to the number paid by the government to remove those crafts or what owners paid for? Maybe I'm mistaken, but I think we need question not completed by the MP.
So we do track. So we have provided warnings or orders to over 95 boat owners, and we are looking at compiling the numbers of those who have taken action to remove their own vessels. So as my colleagues were saying, we track the ones that we remove ourselves, but we can look and see if we can get that data out of our database to see those that we have provided orders to or warnings to that they have taken the action that's required to address their vessels.
Pouvez-vous me donner un exemple de coût?
Could you give me an example of the cost involved to remove the smallest vessel, the biggest vessel, an estimate of what is required to remove those vessels? Maybe there have been some cost incurred over the past few years. What has been the lowest cost or the highest?
Thank you very much for the question. As mentioned earlier, there's a very large range in cost when you're talking about removal of a wrecked, abandoned, or hazardous vessel. And it very much depends on the location in the country. As you can appreciate, Canada has the longest coastline in the world in some very remote areas. And in cases where it is remote, that can increase cost even for a small vessel. A 30-foot vessel in Haida Gwaii to remove is likely to cost significantly more than in the Port of Vancouver, for example, given local capacity. In general, I can say that we have seen cases that range from as low as $5,000 to $10,000 to remove a vessel when it's a simple case, where we can just attach a crane and remove the vessel onto a barge and take it away to a recycling facility. In other cases, it does require in situ deconstruction with long times and multiple crews on site.
Are those vessels more owned by local Canadian, if I can say, or more international, like people or corporation or whatever? Like, what's the ratio? Maybe it was as before, but just for clarification. Sometime I'm not listening, so.
Thank you thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I do not have facts and figures in front of me to break down the proportion of vessels owned by Canadians versus non-Canadians.
Peut-être pour Madame Harper.
Ms. Harper? If I'm not mistaken, you're Director General for, is it for the Atlantic region or for Canada? Perfect. Do you have a number for the abandoned vessels in the Atlantic compared to the West Coast, for example? the number of vessels that have to be removed from our waters. Is there a number for the Atlantic, or are there none at the moment? How many vessels have to be removed at the moment? I will hand over that to my colleague, Ms. Name, because our program is specific to small crafts. I'm sorry, maybe that question was asked before, the number of vessels in the Atlantic coast compared to the Pacific coast.
Thank you very much for the question. What I can say is on the Atlantic coast, since 2016, 459 vessels have been added to the national inventory for the Atlantic coast. And since that same time period, 194 vessels have been removed from the Atlantic coast from that inventory.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier. We'll now start our last round of questioning. We'll start off with Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a 2019, the 2019 current government, they passed the Wrecked, Abandoned, or Hazardous Vessels Act. Last year in July, CTV reported that only 2 fines have been issued since the passing of the law. Why is it that Coast Guard is taking so long on the issuing of fines when it comes to abandoned vessels? In relation to the number of vessels that have been cleaned up, it seems to be a very, very, very small ratio of charges, and there must be a lot more negligence than's being reflected in those charges, obviously, Mr. Brooks.
The Canadian Coast Guard set up its own program, its compliance program, in April 2023. Today, we have 5 administrative pecuniary penalties that were issued to owners that did not comply with regulations. I'll now give the floor to my colleague, Joanne, who may tell you more of what Transport Canada has been doing in their domain of activity.
I'm going to, Mr. Chair, speak to the intent of the Act is to hold vessel owners accountable for the duration of the life cycle of the vessel. So in order to do this, we do education, we work with owners of vessels, and we have a graduated approach to enforcement. So first and foremost, understanding who the owner of the vessel is, as we've talked about, is a challenge, and we're doing some work to increase the ability to identify owners of vessels. And so when it comes to compliance for abandoned vessels, we need to know who the vessel owner is in order to be able to apply an administrative monetary fund.
I've just got one more little thing there on that. Does that 2019 Act, does that go back retroactive, or does it just cut off right there at the date that the Act was passed?
Les obligations des propriétaires.
The obligations for owners towards wrecked, derelict, or hazardous vessels starts in July 2019 when the law entered into force. It's not retroactive.
Carry on.
Okay, so Mr. Chair, we have a graduated approach to enforcement. So first and foremost, we have to find out who the owner is, and sometimes it takes some time in order to do that. And in cases where we do find the owner and we apply the AMP, the intent here is to hold the owner accountable and have them take action to remove the vessel. Therefore, we have had several warnings, orders, 95 that we've issued to date to work with the owners to find a way to remove the vessels. And in last case, we have issued 2 AMPs on the Transport Canada side. And in those cases, intent there is also to bring the owner into compliance and to ensure that they take action and appropriate action to address their vessels.
So So this is about compliance, to bring owners into compliance, not to deter others from breaking the law. You'd think that you'd be issuing these fines where possible as a deterrent, because it seems like the derelict vessels are just piling up for some reason. I mean, if the federal government says they're going to come in and take my trash out, I'm going to let them come in and take it out instead of taking it out myself. Is that what's happening on the waters?
Important to understand that when we look at the national inventory, many of those vessels are legacy vessels and have been abandoned or derelict perhaps for some time, and therefore there are no owners. In other cases, we've been aware of instances where the owner may have left Canada, in which case the powers do not extend outside of our borders. In other cases, the owner may have been deceased. What we are seeing is an increase in fines and administrative monetary penalties being assessed now to non-compliant owners, and when we do have new cases, this is very much the direction we take. We respond to stabilize and prevent pollution, then we work as we can with owners to ensure a good result, and where there is non-compliance, we do have the tools in the legislation to hold them accountable now.
Thank you, Mr. Small. We'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
5 minutes or less. Does anybody ever take the less? Yeah? Okay. Just curious. These are the observations that I have. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So during your testimony, you talked about the regulatory changes that are ongoing, and you talked about 800 or so pieces of feedback from a variety of different stakeholders. So I'm wondering if it's possible to kind of give us a sense of what those 800 stakeholders are saying and what themes may be being present to you folks as you're reviewing this.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think if there's several broad themes that emerged from the consultation, probably the top 2 or 3 revolved around the imposition of a fee in the amount of the proposed implementation of a fee in the amount of $24 every 5 years for the renewal of the pleasure craft license. And the other main issue that we saw was the conversion, the implementation of this 5-year validity period, so that over time the lifetime licenses will be converted to 5 years if there's still a current owner of the vessel, and the holders of a 10-year license will eventually be transitioned over to a shorter 5-year period. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of comment on those two main elements. I think there was an understanding that there needed to be better information on the owner, but at the same time, that information comes at a cost. So
that's very helpful. In terms of the regulatory changes, I think we've addressed some of them, but I'm just wondering if you can dive into some of the key items that we're proposing as we move forward. And then my second piece to that, and it was brought up by one of the witnesses around the graduated enforcement approach, and I had that circled in terms of unpacking what that is, and you did go over that a bit, but can you just kind of go through the step-by-step process of the graduated enforcement approach, just for my purposes? Again, I just want to clearly understand it, so maybe I can go with a follow-up there and then over to you.
Thank you for the question. I'll attempt to be brief. There are many different changes. One, as I mentioned before, was to establish a 5-year validity period for all pleasure craft licenses. Specified license holders have 30 days to transfer license upon the purchase of their pleasure craft. Expand the Minister of Transport authorities to cancel a pleasure craft license for reasons of non-compliance. And an important one is to expand the scope of the licensing requirement to apply to all wind-powered vessels, a sailboat, that are above 6 meters in length. As I mentioned, there's the service fee as well to help recover the cost of operating the program. In terms of the graduated the graduated enforcement process, I'll turn to my colleague, Joanne.
Thank Thank you. I'll just go through if there is an abandoned vessel. For instance, we will try to identify the owner through vessel registration, speaking to the community, and looking to see if we can, in fact, if there is an owner registered to the vessel. If there is not, we do have some opportunities under the Act. We have the authorities to post a 30-day notice to see if the owner will identify itself before we take action on the vessel. Where the owner is known, we would work with the owner. We could either issue an order, we can issue a warning to let them know that they need to bring their vessel into compliance. If they refuse to do so or do not have the means to do so, then we would think about the next course of action. So if they do have the means to pay for an administrative monetary penalty, then we would apply an AMP to the owner.
I have 30 seconds left.
Okay.
Go ahead. You're going to say something. My apologies.
In the case where we do take action to remove the vessel, we would be looking to recover the cost of the removal of the vessel.
So you mentioned just in terms of other measures that could be taken if an individual, for whatever reason, says, I'm not paying it, or you can't find someone to pay for it. You mentioned other measures. Can you unpack that a bit as what other measures are in the toolbox?
Mr. Chair, just for clarification, other measures to bring the owner to compliance?
Yeah,
Is that the
correct.
So in cases where the vessel is not in compliance, we would work to see what kind of measures they can take to bring the vessel into compliance. We would provide them with education on how they can do that to meet the regulations. And in cases where they cannot, then we would assess our next steps to take actions to address the vessel.
Thank you.
Be in for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Oui, merci.
I'll ask a question. I was concerned by the fact that we are not able to tell if there are any wrecks on the St. Lawrence that are a problem to the ecosystem. In 2022, there was funding from the Ocean Protection Plan of $2 billion over 9 years with the objective of better managing maritime navigation to avoid any risks and also to identify any dangerous wrecks. How come nothing has been done on the St. Lawrence? Is there a project, at least?
Mr. Chair, maybe to clarify, there has been a number of vessels that the Canadian Coast Guard has responded to in the St. Lawrence River and in the Gulf over the history of the Coast Guard. What I was offering, Mr. Chair, was that I was not aware of any specific ongoing cases that were taking attention for remediation at this time. The number that I have in total for the central region of vessels removed since 2016-17 is 106. I do not have the specific breakdown for which vessels were in the St. Lawrence, Mr. Chair, but if it's of interest, we certainly could provide those numbers after the fact.
Donc,
So 106 that were identified or removed from the water? I didn't quite understand you, sorry.
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. 106 vessels have been removed from the environment since 2016-2017 in our central region of operations for the Canadian Coast Guard, which includes the St. Lawrence River and the Gulf.
Saint-Laurent et le Golfe, OK. Et dans ces bateaux...
And on those vessels, we don't know if they contained any dangerous material, or it doesn't appear to be the case.
Mr. Chair, what I can offer is that in the most part of cases where the Coast Guard intervenes to remove vessels, it is because there has been a determination of hazard, and so therefore we would have taken action to deal with that threat.
Thank you, Madam Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. So one thing that I was reflecting on while we've been talking, so first of all, we know that 5 fines is highly inadequate since 2019. And there's many reasons behind that I think we could talk about for a long time. But I do want to talk about the fact that I talk to and know so many responsible boat owners and vessel owners who are frustrated about this entire situation. And one thing that's very clear is that we don't have a clear process for vessel owners to understand how to navigate these systems for the entire life of their vessel. And one thing in particular that there seems to be a real gap in is around the dismantling and recycling of vessels. So we touched on this a little bit, but can you clarify whose responsibility is it to develop the systems to appropriately and adequately dismantle and recycle these vessels?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, there is no single authority in Canada who's responsible for vessel recycling. It's a cooperative effort between the federal government, for example, which has certain requirements relating to discharges into the water and environmental protection in that regard. But we also work very closely with our colleagues in the provinces and the municipalities who are responsible for matters such as local land use planning, when the boats are removed from the water for recycling, labor standards, that kind of situation. So it's more of a cooperative approach.
Thank you. I'm happy you brought it up because that's actually another example that's come up. So on Vancouver Island, where I live, I'm lucky to live, there's a place called Union Bay. And in Union Bay, there has been some dismantling and recycling happening. Interestingly enough, even a U.S. vessel was brought up to be dismantled and recycled at the site when we haven't even figured out how to dismantle and recycle our own vessels here. But there has been multiple warnings provided to the center. It's been leaking copper and zinc at levels 100 times the legal limit and 13 times that's the copper and 13 times the legal limit of zinc. There has been no process to ensure that this is being done in an environmentally sustainable way. We've had the BC Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the BC Minister of Waterland and Resource Stewardship call on the federal government asking for, urging them, I should say, to take more action to regulate the dismantling and recycling of vessels at this site. And I'm wondering if somebody could share today whether they feel that this work is being done in cooperation with provinces to ensure that we have adequate recycling and dismantling centers that are actually taking into account the workers' rights and also the environment that's surrounding these centers.
Right.
For the question.
Sorry, Ms. Barron, if we could get an answer to that in writing, it would be better. Ms. Barron has gone way over her 2.5 minute mark. So we'll move on now to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less. And
thank you, Mr. Chair. And as a welcome back gift to MP Barron and the NDP, welcome back to the opposition side. I'm going to offer you that 5 minutes that I had. Thank you.
Just to let Ms. Barron know, it was myself and Mr. Bragdon that negotiated this.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and to my colleague. I have never left the opposition side, but I always appreciate warm welcomes consistently. And so perhaps I can ask for a response to my question. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to provide a response to that question, and thank you for raising that issue of Union Bay. As I mentioned, it is a cooperation between the federal government and the province and the local authorities. And I believe the question was, are we having that good cooperation? And I can say that we are. There are discussions regularly happening between the Department of Environment, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Transport Canada, the various provincial agencies that are responsible local Indigenous groups and others relating to that particular issue in order to make sure that all of the rules are being followed. And I am aware of the fact that there has been some enforcement action taken by the province when it comes to Union Bay, even recently. So it is certainly something that is being looked at quite carefully by all of these orders of government together, taking into account the situation that is there on the ground.
Thank you. The Chair, can you clarify how much time I have?
3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Excellent.
If I take off the 30 seconds you went over in the last one.
I'm just going to keep going. Thank you, Chair. My next question is around mooring plans. And so an interesting example that's been provided to me on the West Coast is that we have situations where people are anchoring in areas that they're allowed to anchor, but there's no plan around the spot that they're anchoring. And then I hate to use this example, but it was provided to me, so now I'm going to. I had an example of a young man who'd gone out to the pub, and somebody offered him a boat for $100, and he thought, oh, this is great, I'll get a boat. So we got the boat for $100. Then he realized the boat was far too damaged to actually be worth doing anything with, and then he just left it there. So it was anchored and left to just sit there because it was far more expensive for him to do anything about it than it was just to leave it sitting there. And so one thing that's been brought to my attention is that if there was a mooring plan that provided some sort of a planning process for where boats can actually be left to anchor, that would help us with the identification and responsibility of these vessels. And I'm wondering if I can get a federal perspective on that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think this just points to the importance of the regulatory changes that I've spoken about earlier in the context of making sure that the information in the pleasure craft licensing database is as up to date as possible, that the vessels are appropriately marked, so that an owner in a transaction such as that, the previous owner could be tracked down via the appropriate processes. And I should just turn, because at that point, when it becomes a vessel then that is abandoned or dilapidated or derelict, I'll first pass the microphone to my colleague from the Navigation Protection Program.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of a vessel that has been moored or unlawfully or without consent for over 60 days, we consider that a dilapidated vessel, and therefore we'd be able to take action on it.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, because I believe I have a little bit of time left, is around we were talking around cooperation. I know that there are many First Nations in my riding, for example. The Snuneymuxw First Nation has an entire pilot. They're ready and willing to do the work alongside the federal government to clean up the vessels that are in the Snuneymuxw territory. They just need to see the federal government working alongside them. So there's a ton of local wealth of knowledge, and they just need the resources to be able to do the work effectively. What does that look like?
Thank you very much for the question. We recognize that the Canadian Coast Guard, Transport Canada, and our Government of Canada partners, the importance that Indigenous communities, in particular First Nations, play on the West Coast. Through the Oceans Protection Plan, there has been investments made to expand the participation of Indigenous communities in the Marine Emergency Response Network, and we are leveraging those investments to do so and growing those partnerships. In particular, we're working on the West Coast with the Council for the Advancement of Native Development Officers, for example, and we're piloting ways in which we can understand how to bring Indigenous communities into the network to monitor hazardous vessels or wrecked abandoned hazardous vessels or anything of concern, and contribute that information back to the system to be full partners in that. And we're leveraging technology through Canadian firms such as Barnacle, who provide us with monitoring abilities from a remote destination. So we can put on board a kit that's about the size of a suitcase, unpack it, and understand if the vessel is staying in the same location, if it's taking on water, if it's listing, and things like that. And so we're working really effectively, I think, to expand those partnerships and find nations that would like to partner with us on this.
It's over time. So we're going to call it a day, I think. I believe Mr. Hanley had something he wanted to say before I thank our witnesses for their appearance here today. Mr. Henley.
I'll be quick, Mr. Small. I just, as the chair mentioned at the beginning, I am moving to the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, so I just wanted to take the chance to thank you, Mr. Chair, for your excellent chairing over the 3 years that I've been on this committee. I also wanted to thank the clerk and the staff, the analysts and the supporting staff, and also all the members for your participation and collegiality and support. I think it's been a great committee. I think I've learned a lot. We've accomplished a lot, and I hope that continues. And I'll be back next week as a sub for the Yukon report, so I will be seeing more of you. Thank you very much.
Perfect. I want to say a big thank you to
Point of order.
Mr. Bragdon. You're a little bit late.
I won't keep you over time.
But
This is very collegial.
Okay,
quick. It's very
quickly.
I just want to say, Dr. Henley, you've been a pleasure to have on the committee, and always enjoy your feedback and input. Look forward to seeing you coming quite regularly as a sub as we try and draft Mr. Calkins in as much as we can too on subbing. So it's great to have you show up anytime. You'll be welcome. Anyways. Thanks, witnesses.
Thank you to Department of Transportation
always great.
And the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for their appearance here today and sharing their knowledge with the committee for 2 hours. So again, thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll see you again somewhere along the way. Meeting adjourned. And next Monday, just a reminder, next Monday we will start consideration of version 1 of the draft report on the Yukon salmon study. So that's the one Mr. Hanley might be interested in. So again, enjoy. Meeting adjourned.